the follow-up to the talk given yesterday by Guy Bonin. And I will be diffusing from it in two directions, I would say. So I will start with a quick recap in 2 minutes for people who might not have been there yesterday. So roughly, the idea is that when you construct, when you look at ecological interactions, a given mechanism for how species interact and coexist can be understood as a given structure in the network of species interactions. So for instance, if all species fall on a trade-off between two traits, then their interaction matrix will have a very specific structure.
Matthieu, maybe, yeah. I'm not sure, maybe we don't see the same screen than you. I'm sorry, because I was in your screen, I thought it was okay, but right now we see just the list of slides and not...
Okay. Let me try to see. Does it work? Maybe. Does this work now? Do you see the slides?
So I see your first two slides, actually. I see like a gray thing and with the two first slides.
All right, then I will just share my desktop and hopefully, is it better?
Yes, much better.
Okay, thank you very much.
No, you're welcome. I'm sorry, I have not seen before.
No, my bad. And do you hear me well? No problem? Good. Okay, thanks. Right, so as I was saying, it's a follow-up to Guy's talk. And so, yeah, so if you have a given mechanism for how species interact, for instance, if they all fall on a trade-off between two traits, then this will reflect into their interaction network or interaction matrix as a fairly specific structure. And there are many such mechanisms that have been proposed in the ecological literature. And it's not clear at all which one, if any, is more important or more common in the real world. So if all the interactions within one community stem from the same mechanism, from the same traits, for instance, then you expect the matrix to be very ordered in some sense, that there are strong correlations between all those interactions. On the other hand, if there are many factors that enter into each interaction, then asymptotically, you can imagine that even each interaction is independent of all others. So how you interact with a given species doesn't say anything about how you will interact about some other species, with some other species. And this is what we would like to call a high-dimensional interaction structure, since there are many underlying mechanisms, different factors. So if interactions look uncorrelated, if they look random when you look at them, is it really because of this high dimensionality? Or it could be because of noisy measurements or because interactions are not well defined or something. There are many different problems that could occur. But if it is truly high dimensionality, then interactions should look pretty random, so they should not look ordered. But they should not look completely random, because we've known for a while now that fully random interaction matrices do not allow species to persist together. So the disorder theory, like a theory for these high-dimensional systems, predicts that if species coexist, there has to be some subtle biases in this matrix. And just to finish the recap, what Guy showed yesterday, and this is another figure for the same results, is that while all the many interactions that you can measure look very random, there is a lot of variance and everything, they actually very precisely follow subtle biases in there that were predicted by theory. So this really reassures us that this apparent randomness is not just measurement noise or measurement error or something like this. It's really the randomness that you expect from high dimensionality. So, okay, we have some potential evidence in data for this high dimensional idea, this high dimensional vision of interactions. Now to think first, okay, a step back, which is why does it seem like a good idea to search for high dimensional or random looking interactions in data? And a step forward, which is, if we take this as a null model, as a starting point, how do we build on it to go towards ecosystems that are not completely random, that do have more structure in them? So I'll start with a step back. And the reason why we think it's an interesting starting point is you can think of it as a kind of limit. So if you start from species being all identical and you add more and more ways that they're different, eventually you tend towards a limit where the dynamics that you see are generic in the sense that, well, first of all, they're very different from those that you would expect in special motifs of a few species, such as a food chain, for instance. But they're very broadly seen among many different networks. And in particular, they're the same behaviors that you would see if the network was truly random. So you can use random networks to model those behaviors. And we can call systems that can be modeled by random networks disordered systems, even though we're not making at all the claim that there is true randomness here. It's very possible that if you took a microscope or you went to the pathways of all the interactions, you could understand each of those interactions mechanistically. That's very possible. But put all together, they behave as if they have the same type of dynamics as a random network. So what do you gain from taking these viewpoints? Well, what you gain is that if the network, the global network, is very disordered, if there is no overarching structure in there, many local details do not matter for the global dynamics. So this is just a small simulation example where I consider two different simulation models with different details, different parameterizations. So one is a predation model, the other one is a competition model in some specific limits and everything, but they're different models. And if by chance those two models give you the same value for just a few moments, a few statistics of the interaction matrix, then all the outcomes, all the dynamics that result from this will be the same. So for instance, you will see the same species abundance distribution. You will see the same dynamics in general, response to perturbations, and so on and so forth, despite those two models describing, in principle, very distinct microscopic, like small-scale reality. So if the network is disordered, it really means that you don't need to know every detail to say something. And so then one of the perks of this is, for instance, it's not a problem if your interactions are fluctuating over time, if they're context dependent, if they're complicated in many ways, as long as those statistics are reasonably preserved. So to kind of summarize what you gain from this kind of disordered models, you have theory, which is a kind of black box, which takes as input only a few statistics of the interaction network. So no need to know all the network, just basically mean, variance, and symmetry of the interactions. And as outputs, give you a lot of things. Things such as the pattern that Guy was presenting yesterday. Other things such as distributions at one given, in one snapshot, such as an abundance distribution, diversity, fluxes, spatial distributions. Many such things can be in principle imagined out of this kind of models. And you have dynamical information. So do you expect, depending on those parameters, to see a single equilibrium, to see chaos, to see alternate stable states, tipping points, what kind of response to perturbations do you expect? So really the perk of this is to go beyond single prediction theories, which, like random networks, for instance, have been used a lot to talk about stability and stability only, but you could really use them to try to, at the same time, predict a whole bunch of different things in the same system. What you lose, on the other hand, is your ability to talk about particular species, because if you go into this direction, you're only talking about aggregate properties at the scale of the whole community. And not anymore, you cannot anymore predict things about one special species somewhere in there in detail. So if you see that, you can ask, okay, if there are so many predictions that could come out of these simple disordered models, why, when we tried to provide empirical evidence for them with Guy, did we focus on the kind of subtle biases in the interaction matrix that I was mentioning earlier? And the reason for this, in my opinion, is it's really hard to validate models, many species models in community ecology, because most of the features that are easy to measure, such as abundance distributions, there are many, many different models that will get them right within empirical error. So the things that you can easily measure, they're not very good for discerning what's the right model underneath. And the more specific things, maybe more, the things that would be more characteristic of a given model. So dynamical properties, do you see chaos? Do you see, can you really quantify the response to perturbations or these kind of things? They're typically very, very hard to test empirically because of all the environmental noise, all the external forces that are really driving the dynamics that we see. And in my opinion, that is why there is very, very little evidence yet of what I would really call truly collective behavior in species interaction networks, especially when you compare to other biological networks, such as neural networks, bird flocks, all sorts of things, where we have known and we have had, like, striking evidence for decades that yes, there is something obviously collective happening there, and there's no other explanation. So that to me is actually a striking thing about community ecology, something that's, and maybe evolution also, something that's worth thinking about. Why is it so hard to see this kind of collective behaviors? And maybe we have hope with Guy and a few colleagues that there is experimental evidence incoming, but I will shush for now. So, okay, if we have accepted that this model can be used as a kind of null model, because if you assume that you can reduce yourself to a few parameters, you can make predictions, and then you can test if those predictions are right. And maybe they will be wrong, but at least it's a null model that you can test. The question now is, how do you build upon when you know that things are going to be very different from the null model, or quite different from the null model? So I would like to take a minute to think, what are the alternatives in ecological theories to this simple disordered viewpoint? One, as long as we're looking at really many species models. So one class of alternatives is, I would say, variance or special cases of disorder. So the neutral model, where every species is identical, is kind of a special point in parameter space. Sparse models, higher order interactions, all those things might have still the same general spirit of we only want to know a few stats and to make many predictions from them. So I would say roughly those are sibling things, and we should just talk with each other and figure out a kind of unified framework for testing those things. You have other candidates which are much more different. One possible candidate is that your system really truly obeys some kind of low dimensional order. So this is what people do, for instance, when they do size-based models, where all the dynamics, what matters is the size of the organisms. And this has been done for food webs, has been done for different types of networks. Or assuming that there are really a few important traits that really control everything that's happening. Like between plants, maybe are you a nitrogen fixer or not, and so on and so forth. So that would be another world, and this low dimensional order is more the world of, let's say, traditional theoretical ecology, the models where you really define species by their role on one axis. And then there is a third alternative that I want to push away for now, which is what I would call true complexity. That's somewhere between the simple order and disorder, which is one where actually you would have many details, many things matter, and you cannot really ignore any of them. You cannot go to these statistical limits, like let's say a circuit or a computer program, where if you just randomly ignore letters in the program, it's not going to compile. There's no chance of working. So I'm hoping that we can avoid the last one, because if the last one is true, then our only solution is to measure millions of things. But maybe the world is such. So I really want to go to this kind of distinction between those two big archetypes, I would say, of simplicity, which is either low dimensional order, high order. So low dimensional order really means that if you look at a species, you can characterize it by its role, its position, something in the network in some sense, something like its size, its traffic height, its function in the network. There's a low, like a simple explanation for what it's doing. High dimensional disorder, on the other hand, we are saying that species are all different, but there's no obvious role. It's more like a crowd or a heap of things. And that's why you get, in a sense, only few parameters matter. Knowing really what each species is doing is not nearly as important. So you can really deviate from this order. And one of the ways that we did that is we said, in a way that I will exemplify later, in a simulation, you can smoothly interpolate between a very random network with no structure whatsoever. So that's to the left of these graphs, and a very ordered network, for instance, to the right of these graphs. So for instance, different types of order could be a completely triangular matrix, so something like a cascade model. So one species eats everyone, the next species eats everyone except the first one, and so on and so forth. Something very directed. Another possibility is having multiple groups, like a block structure in the matrix, or other kinds of structure. And as you go from very uniform in the matrix to very structured like this, what I show on the y-axis here is how much error you're making when you're trying to predict species abundances and stability, like abundance distributions and stability properties, from only the mean and variance and symmetry of the interactions. So only from those parameters of the disordered model. And so what you see is that among the various things that I have been testing, some of them have basically no impact on how much error you're making, because typically they're local properties. But the things that do have an impact are much more global properties at the scale of the whole network. So there is a kind of macroscopic structure in the network that makes you deviate away from pure disorder, and you have to take it into account somehow. And so when we saw that, our thought was that basically what we want is a combination of the two, of simple order and disorder. And just for kind of, I don't know, fancy justification, even though it's from a very unrelated field, but I love that I can cite Terence Tao on this. There is this idea that in many cases, you can take a complex looking object and decompose it into relatively simple structure and relatively random noise around the structure. And so the hope, I guess, the program that we're trying to push to some extent is the idea that systems that you would think are truly complex, that every details matters maybe, we can hope that maybe they behave more like an interpolation between simple order and disorder. And the reason why I would hope that this is true is that true complexity, as I defined before, it's just an intuition, but my hand-wavy intuition is that it's really not robust to perturbations. Like, as I said before, if you remove a letter from a computer program, it's not going to work. So this might be true for very co-evolved networks. Maybe it's true for networks within one organism to have really this tight coupling that allows a very special structure to maintain itself. But in ecology, in ecosystems, let's say, I would probably not expect that you have this kind of true complexity. And I would more hope that or expect that you have some kind of simple order plus lots of disorder around. And so to treat this actually is very easy. There are algorithms that really are defined as the best way. If, for instance, if you assume that there are group structures in your network, you can infer the right groups through stochastic block models or tools like this. They are the right tools to infer precisely the parameters that we want. So instead of having just a single disordered graph with a single value of mean and variance of interaction, now you can have two groups and you will have a matrix of means, a matrix of variances, and a matrix of symmetries between them. And by simply doing this two-group approximation, you can really capture any intermediate level of ordering between the completely disordered and the completely ordered graph, at least in the simple cases that we have looked at. Maybe I'll skip this point. Another example here is from a food web, where the food web looks complicated, although it does have a kind of coherent trophic level structure. And you can treat each trophic level as a single disordered group. And you just need to know what's the mean and variance of interactions between those four groups. So it is, it's quite a few parameters, but it's much fewer parameters than if you had to know each interaction of those, 100 species or something. And from only that, the theory really predicts basically the biomass, the fraction of survivors, diversity. And you can do this kind of things for any other simple kind of order. So really the idea that we're putting forward is the idea that the two simple ways that you can look at ecosystems, presumably, is either you really go and identify some very simple order in the system. You have clearly plants and you have clearly pollinators, or you have a clear food chain structure and everything is very well aligned. And you can treat this purely using the low dimensional few species models that are common in theoretical ecology. There's this other limit of purely random networks, which is also very simple in its own way and very nice, and that we should push also. And probably in most cases that you will look at, that's cases that have more structure than just, you know, a few grass plants in the grasslands in this experiment. You will need some kind of combination of the two. And there are, in principle, and we're hoping to develop more and more, ways to really figure out what is the right structure that we want to put there. So, all right, that's it for me. Thanks a lot for your attention.